we want to make sure that we're working together. And there's a couple of things that we've learned from Zoom. Number one is that if you unmute and multiple people are talking at the same time, nobody can hear anybody. So what we're going to do is we're going to practice something right now on your computers. Basically on a PC, you should have something down at the bottom that says reactions. If you're not on a PC, if you're on an iPad, you may have something that says more. Either way, if you click on that, you should see like there's a little clapping hand or a thumbs up. And what I'm going to ask you to do right now to see if you can find it is actually click on one of those hands, or just to put it up there, just so we know that you know how to do that. Oh, a lot of you do. This is,
yeah, that looks great.
Everybody's doing pretty good with that. Okay. Okay, so what we're going to do is basically, Lynda's going to try to run this very similar to how she does a typical in-person program. So she's going to do like a bit of a summary of the book, and then she's going to throw out some questions. So what we're going to do on our side is we're going to ask you, if you want to make a comment, that you use that little reaction and you put up your hand. Now, we're probably not going to get to everybody. We're only going to pick out maybe 3 to 5 people, depending on our time for each question. But we're going to try to do, when we do that, we will unmute you and you can talk. And then as soon as you're done, we're going to mute you again. But the one thing that we're asking is that you make your comments brief. So that's an important part of this as well. So if everybody understands, if everyone was good with that, go ahead and do your little reaction again. Give me a thumbs up if you are good with what we're talking about. Yes? Okay, fantastic. Okay, so the other thing that I want to say to you is that it is our first time doing this with Lynda, and we welcome your constructive criticism afterwards, because we want to keep making this better. So after this is all over, we will probably be sending out an email, and we ask you to tell us, you know, what you thought of today. And we definitely want your feedback to try to make it better and better. But at this point, Lynda, did I forget anything?
That's it. Sounds good.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Lynda. And as I said, what we'll do when she asks a question, I will be the one who says, Phyllis, I see your hand up. And then we'll unmute Phyllis. Okay? Go ahead, Lynn.
Okay, great. Well, I am so delighted to welcome everybody to our first Zoom book club meeting. And of course, especially delighted to be doing such a well-received book as Educated by Tara Westover. Zoom, by the way, gives a whole new meaning to the expression of face-to-face. I'm having so much fun looking at all of your faces as they pop up on the screen. You know, one of the things that Debbie and I talked about is so much of the enjoyment of a book club is the spontaneous discussion that is generated. And so of course, today's not going to be as spontaneous, but we're really looking forward to your participation after. So let me ask you by a thumbs up, how many of you have read the book? How many have read the book? Yeah, do your signal. Oh, great. Okay, good. And did you enjoy it? Yeah? Okay, well, I'm not surprised you enjoyed it. The book has sold over 4 million copies, and it was on the New York Times bestseller list for over 2 years. It's a favorite, we know that, of the Obamas. And in fact, it's come in second in terms of sale to Michelle Obama's memoir, Becoming, which is really amazing because you know hers is really off the charts. Speaking of memoirs, this one is Tara's book, Tara Westover's book, is reminiscent of J.D. Vance's memoir. How many of you read Hillbilly Elegy? Yeah? Have you read Hillbilly Elegy? Some of us in the Sterling Road Library Book Club did. Both of these books are coming-of-age stories about making it beyond the limitations of one's birth and environment. And both of these people have created new and different lives, although clearly this book shows a life, Tara Westover's life, which was far more harrowing than any we've read before. So who is Tara Westover? Let me give you a bare bones biography. She was born to survivalist parents in rural Idaho in 1986. She received a BA from Brigham Young University in 2008 and was subsequently awarded a Gates Cambridge Scholarship. She earned a master's in philosophy from Trinity College in 2009, and in 2010 was a visiting fellow at Harvard. She returned to Cambridge, where she was awarded a PhD in history in 2014. Currently, she's at Harvard. She's a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center, and she's working on a project related to media and political polarization. And as you know, Educated is her first book. So this resume would be absolutely amazing and so impressive for anybody, but all the more so considering her background. In her memoir, she's going to she'll fill in all the blanks for us from this little bare bones biography, because she's going to tell all about the years and all of the angst that took her to the point where she is now. I want to, by the way, share with you that there are many wonderful interviews with her. If you'd like to go online, go to YouTube. You'll see a lot of good interviews. There was one I want to bring to your attention. It was with Bill Gates. And the reason I bring it to your attention is you heard in her bio that she's now at Harvard working on political polarization. And in this interview, Bill Gates points out to her that, of course, we have this political polarization in our country right now. And it's interesting that her family also has this amazing political separation, because two of her brothers, along with her, made it off the mountain, and they also went ahead and went to college and achieved PhDs. And the rest of her siblings, there, of course, you said she's the youngest of 7, the rest of her siblings are all still on the mountain working as adults alongside of the parents. So there is this divide between the rural and the urban. And this really bothers her. This bothers Tara Westover. She says that the disturbing thing is that the fault lines are around education. She says education has to be accessible to everyone. It should be an instrument of equalizing rather than dividing. She says somehow we do have to find a way that the rural community will understand the cities, the urban communities, and of course the other way around. And she stresses how important it is that each side look at the divide between them and try to understand each other's lifestyle, what their needs are, what they think, and do it without hostility. And she's very interested in it, and she has an interesting perspective when you think about it, because she's been part of both the rural community and the urban community, and she's very interested in exploring that idea. Now, speaking of rural, that brings me to talk to you a little bit about the setting of the book. I also am going to be able to tell you a little bit about the author's beautiful style of writing in a sample that I'm going to read to you. But her setting takes place on the Westover farm where she spends her childhood. And as we mentioned, it's rural Idaho, pretty isolated on a gentle hillside, which, to use the author's language, the hills slope upward and stitch themselves to the mountain base. I love that language. The mountain that she speaks of is known as Buck's Peak. Now, picture that her father used to call the mountain Indian Princess because each year when the snows began to melt, the shape of a woman's body emerged on the mountain face. Her father told her that the nomadic Indians had watched for the appearance of the Indian Princess in the mountains because that was actually a sign of spring, and it was a signal that the mountain was thawing and the winter was over and it was time to come home. As Tara grows up and becomes educated, it's clear that it's going to be very hard for her to come home. The mountain has a strong hold on her, and it's almost a character in the book. It's interesting that no matter how much she changes, how many goals she attains, how much she struggles, the mountain and her conflicted feelings about her family are continuing to call her home. In the prologue, Westover writes a beautiful description of the mountain, and I think her language again is beautiful. She says, "The hill is paved with wild wheat. If the conifers and the sagebrush are soloists, the wheat field is a corps de ballet, each stem following the rest in bursts of movement, a million ballerinas bending one after the other as great gales of wind dent their golden heads. The shape of that dent lasts only a moment and is as close as anyone gets to seeing the wind." Don't you think that's beautiful? Yeah? Okay. So I want to give you just a brief summary here. She is, of course, the youngest of 7 children, she tells us, but what she doesn't tell you in any brief bio is that she was never even given a birth certificate until she was 9 years old. The government had no idea that she existed and that 4 of her siblings existed either. No one was ever really sure, by the way, of her birth date, and so she got to celebrate her birthday whenever she wanted to. So you can imagine how hard it was for her to get a passport later in life. What's important to know is that her father was opposed to public education, saying, "I may as well surrender my children to the devil himself." He believed that schools teach the work of Satan and the Illuminati, and therefore she never attended school. It was her older brother Tyler that taught her to read. Not only that, but there was no organized homeschooling. Mother tried to do school with them, but soon gave it up when their father kept interrupting to bring the children, who he called his crew, back to work in the junkyard, which was how he sustained his living. Tara was 8 when her mother's attempt at homeschooling ended. The first time Tara stepped into a classroom was when she was 17 years old. Her parents were survivalists, so even as a child, she was preparing for the end of the world, and she was busy stocking home canned peaches. And in the summer, she was stewing herbs for her mother, who was a midwife and a healer. And in the winter, she was salvaging in her father's junkyard. Well, maybe that doesn't sound so bad, but if you remember from reading in the book, it was really, really dangerous work. In other words, even as a little girl, she had to climb up into this very high bin, and she was scrapping. She was separating tin from aluminum and copper and iron. And what made it dangerous also was that her father never allowed them to see a doctor or a nurse, and forget about a hospital. Picture that her father was also sorting beside her, and so he would be throwing these huge pieces of metal into the bin, often hitting her, no matter how hard she tried to duck. For Tara and her siblings, gnashes and concussions, even severe burns from explosions, were not uncommon, and they were all treated at home with herbalism. One of the reviewers commented that the junkyard was a catalog of job site horrors. The family was so isolated from mainstream society that there was no one to ensure safety, or that the children received an education, or no one to intervene when Tara's older brother Sean became violent and abusive to her. The question is, what made her even want to go to college and leave the mountain? As she looks back on it, it was really because she loved singing, and she wanted to learn more about singing and maybe become a choir teacher. So she decided, well, maybe she would go to college. Her older brother Tyler had gone, and he was encouraging her. She lacked formal education of any kind, so she began to educate herself. She bought an algebra book, and she taught herself algebra and trigonometry. She learned enough mathematics and grammar to be admitted to Brigham Young University, where she ended up studying history. And the world changed for her, because all of a sudden, for the first time, she learned about important world events like the Holocaust, the civil rights movement. She had never heard of Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King. She tells the story that she was once in class and there was a picture with a caption. And she raised her hand and said to the teacher, "You know, there's a word that I don't understand." Teacher said, "What's the word?" She said, "The word is Holocaust." The teacher's response was, "Thanks for that." Later, a student told her that it was nothing to make fun of. It wasn't a joke. Tara had no idea that she had come across like a Holocaust denier. She later looked up the word Holocaust and, of course, learned the enormity and the scope of the horror. But even with these huge gaps in her education at the university, her professors were recognizing her talent and her core intellect. And for the first time, she was being mentored and encouraged. Her quest for knowledge transformed her, and it took her over oceans and continents. It took her to Harvard and, of course, to Cambridge. And it was only then that she began to wonder if she had traveled too far and if there was, in fact, a way home. In fact, what we come to see is that her transformation caused a great divide in her family. In a recent interview, she explained, as she was moving more and more towards the mainstream, her parents were becoming more and more radical. In the end, she does have a close relationship with 3 of her brothers and some aunts, some uncles, but none, of course, with her brother Sean or her parents. And one common question that is often asked is, how did her parents take it after she published this book? And the answer was obviously not well. I found an article where their lawyer was explaining about the parents and what their response was. And he said, you know, like most parents, Val and LaRue Westover love their daughter, but it is from afar. They take issue with so much of what she says. They say what Tara calls an extremist mindset in the way she was raised. They call it self-sufficiency. Her parents are disappointed that she would write a book that maligns them and their religion and their homeschooling. They say they chose to teach the children at home, and they take a lot of pride in the fact that not only did she gain entry to college, but she actually even got a scholarship. Of course, they don't take into account her own perseverance. They deny some of her claims that her father has schizophrenia or that her mother was left from a car accident with a severe brain injury. The lawyer says, although, and this is in quotes, there's a little germ of truth in the book, it falsely portrays the Westover family. Because they love their daughter, they are not going to take her to court. The lawyer says everybody should read this book and take it with a grain of salt. Well, her parents might have been disappointed with the book, but everyone else has given it rave reviews. And for us, what's really lovely is it's going to give us a lot to talk about. So that brings us to our very first question. And that is, get ready guys to respond. What is it, do you think, that made this story, which is so specific about her life, what made this memoir resonate with so many people?
Remember, use your little reaction at the bottom and put up your hand, and we will call in a couple of people.
Debbie, how do I get back my my gallery group here? I've just
Should be at the
well,
top.
I just got one
gallery.
person on here.
Just say gallery.
I'm gonna go up here and see what that is. Gallery view. Okay, good. I got my gallery view back. I like looking at everyone. Okay, good.
Okay. And then,
what do you guys think?
oops. I'm looking for hands. Did anybody put up a hand?
Yes,
Go for it.
I think it's a coming of age, like Anne of Green Gables, and we really connect because we're people who came of age ourselves. And we can remember our lives.
Exactly. In fact, it's interesting because I was listening to Oprah, an interview. She had a wonderful, whole long conversation with her. And Oprah says to her, you know, she recommends this book to anybody who is going through any difficulties in their life, because she finds the book so inspiring, so motivational for people who are going through any difficulties, that you can overcome obstacles that are in your path. Any other thoughts on that one? Moving on. I'm going to read to you the epigraph, which is right in the front of the book by Virginia Woolf, and that's the one that she chose to put in with her book.
Lynda.
Yeah.
Judy had a comment.
Oh, good. I'm sorry. Go for it.
What stood out for me was her determination to overcome the obstacles and to find out what was available for her in her life, which I think is so important for all of us, you know, overcoming obstacles and accepting our lives or changing our lives.
Right. It really contains a great life's lesson for everybody, right? And that's, I think, the general appeal of the book.
Lynda.
Yeah.
There was also in, oh, go ahead. There's Cookie has her hand up as well.
Cookie, did you have something?
Cookie, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay. Remember what a bright person she is. After all, I could have no education and take an algebra book and teach it to myself. I mean, I think that she really, you know, her brain was really very important in her education.
Absolutely. It really speaks to her native, her born intellect. Absolutely.
Also, Stephanie had a comment, Stephanie Swerdlow.
Yeah, I think that it was also seemed very pertinent to me in terms of today's world. And within this family, the difference between the whole survivalist anti-government kind of struggle and what's the, you know, what's more normative. So I think that for me was very riveting.
And just to follow up on that, I think also what is very painful in the story is that when this divide between, and we're going to call it rural and urban thinking, when she's becoming educated, and I put that in quotes, all of a sudden you see the differences. You know, her father, they are not willing to look at each other than with hostility, and he's looking at her with disdain. As opposed to really trying to understand where she's, harder and harder for her to understand where he's coming from. So you really do see this huge divide. The epigraph at the beginning
Paula
of
has a hand up too. We'll have this be the last comment with this question, I think. But Paula, can you unmute your, yeah.
Yes, I am unmuted. I think it's important for the reader to notice that Tara, even though this family has physically and mentally and emotionally abused her, she still has affection for them.
Matt Bobby is.
No matter how badly they treated her. So he was really trying
like the guy from
to get together.
What's
Yeah.
the TV show?
Absolutely. I think that's true, that really is, it is one of the more painful things about the story is that she is really still desperate. She wants to have it all, right? She wants what she has in the way of her education. She wants them to accept that part of her. And unfortunately, yeah, that's the painful part of it. They don't. So in the epigraph, the author writes, Tara Westover writes, the past is beautiful because pardon? Okay. The past is beautiful because one never realizes an emotion at the time. It expands later, and thus we don't have complete emotions about the present, only the past. Why do you think she chose this as the epigraph for her story, for her story? Shall I read it again? The past is beautiful because one never realizes an emotion at the time. It expands later, and thus we don't have complete emotions about the present, only the past. Any thoughts? Okay, I'm going to share my thoughts, okay? I think it's very appropriate that she chose this because especially for any of us in childhood, we don't appreciate at the time what's happening. It sometimes takes years later for us to really appreciate that which we had or that which we didn't have. And only when looking back on it do you really have the fullest perspective of what occurred. And in Tara's case, she didn't realize at the time she was living in that house, she didn't realize what was going on. She didn't realize the dangers that she and her siblings were exposed to. She didn't realize the chaos. She didn't know that that everyone wasn't having a lack of education. But as an adult looking back, she's able to see it clearer. And it changes her perspective entirely. And she admits it is not easy to navigate through these memories. She still always says she's trying to remember that which was beautiful and to reconcile that which was not. Any other thoughts on that? So here's
Stephanie has her hand up.
Sorry. So I think what also, it's very difficult because I found this situation, her home situation, very abusive. I found it abusive. I found the brothers, not only the father's relationship with all his kids and his wife, but the brother's relationship with Tara, Sean's relationship. I mean, it was abusive and cruel. There was a cruelty there. And when you're in an abusive situation at the time, it's very difficult to separate yourself from that and somehow not to see that somehow you're causing all this hurt and world of hurt to be heaped upon you. So I think that that's also then speaks to the epitaph.
Karen also had a comment. We need to unmute Karen. Hold on one second, Karen.
Stephanie, that's absolutely right. And you would be sensitive to that. I always know you're going to come up with something with your social work background, but that's absolutely so clear in this particular story. Yeah.
So I think also that her relationship with her mother, she was disappointed by her mother, that she thought her mother was going to defend her, be on her side, and then she let her down. She thought she and her sister were going to be united, and that didn't work out. But then in the end, the two brothers were really there for her to the end, and the sister-in-law. So I think she could see the relationships in the family differently than.
Absolutely right. All of a sudden she had a fuller perspective, right? She had a broader perspective. So what would you say that her definition of educated is? What do you think?
I think it's not just the education of life. I mean, it's also, I mean, I meant the other way. It's not just what you learn in the books. I think that her education, period, her whole life is an education, and that you can be educated from many different ways.
Absolutely. We learn about that, how she learned. Think about her life on the mountain, just the whole idea of the seasons and the cycles and all of that. She learned so much from that. What else would you say would be but the way she would define a person who is educated? What does that person possess?
Beverlee has her hand up.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I think the word educated, for me, after I finished reading this horrific, astounding book, and I agree with what you said earlier, this is a testament to her brilliance, her determination, and the fact that you can overcome. That's the most simplistic view of it. But I think the word educated is not just about her getting an awareness of the world, but it's also an education for the reader to realize what a person goes through and can overcome. So I think it's a two-way street with regard to the title Educated. Thank you.
Very, very nice thought. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
There's a message in the chat room from Arlene. And she said, education is not being taught by others. It's finding out information on our own and validating what is real.
Beautiful. In fact, that's just about Tara's own words, because she talks about the idea of education is self-discovery, the ability to understand other points of view, to have the ability also to find your own voice. And that was, I think, a part of it as well. Not let others speak for you. And if you remember, throughout the book, she's talking about everybody else is defining her, right? She keeps seeing herself as this girl in the junkyard, working in the junkyard. That's how she was seen. She also sees herself even the way her abusive brother, Sean, speaks of her, right? Remember how he speaks of her? He calls her a whore. She thinks of herself that way as well. So she has such low self-esteem. And so she doesn't have her own voice. And of course, the beauty at the end of the book is what? She finds her voice and she realizes her voice is as strong as anybody else's. And that to her would be educated. So speaking of education, how did so she learned the math, she learned the grammar, and she learned all of that, but how else did she educate herself to prepare herself to take the ACTs? I mean, my own grandchildren are taking ACTs now. I see what goes into this preparation. So how did she do it beyond just the math and the grammar? Okay, so I will tell you that what I thought was amazing is that she learned to read basically by reading the Bible, by reading the journals of the old Mormon prophets, And she would write her own analysis. She wrote her own forms of essays. She, of course, never knew how to write a correct essay, but she would write it. And so she talks about the fact that she had a very high level of reading by the time she came to school. Her father did believe in reading. They did learn how to read because her father wanted them to be able to read the scripture. But other than reading, all other things were just, they were just extraneous, and they were not necessary for life according to her father. So she did read the Bible. What was interesting though, is she describes the journals of the old Mormons, and she says that their stories were vivid, but their lectures were abstract. They were treatises on obscure philosophical studies. And she says, and I thought this was really interesting, in retrospect, and I'm quoting, I see that this, in other words, going through these old journals and reading this stuff, that was my education, the one that matters. The hours I spent sitting at my brother's borrowed desk, struggling to parse narrow strands of Mormon doctrine. The skill I was learning was a crucial one, the patience to read things I could not yet understand. So she has this way of turning this into such a positive, right?
Lynda,
Yeah.
there's also another comment in the chat from Joyce, and she was saying that she thinks Jeanette Wall's The Glass Castle was the first to attain great acclaim in this genre. And I agree with you, Joyce, because I was thinking the same. That was one of those books that you were like, how did she go, and this, so what do you have to say about that?
And this goes back to why this book is so popular. Those books, I think all of us that have read that book remember it. Certain stories are very, very memorable, and especially when they're true stories that these people have lived through. Absolutely. So do you remember in the book the experience of Randy Weaver? Do you guys remember that? And Ruby Ridge. We know it as Ruby Ridge. Do you remember the story of that? So let's talk a little bit about the tremendous effect that had on the entire family, and especially Tara. Do you remember? Any thoughts on that? Just to refresh your memory. The story about Randy Weaver, his whole family, now mind you, Tara's father goes ahead and he gathers the group together, and he tells these little children, a lot of them were little children, Tara was like 5 years old, and he's telling them the story that nearby, on a nearby hillside in Idaho, there is a family that right now is surrounded by the feds, and the feds are after them because they are going to force these children to go to school, and that's the reason that they are surrounding the house. And then he tells the kids that the 14-year-old son was shot, and that the father was going to retrieve the body, and that he was shot. The son was killed, by the way. The father was just shot. But the mother rushes to the door to go ahead and see what's happening where her husband is, and another shot is fired, and the mother is actually killed with a baby in her arms. So this is the scene that he sort of describes fully to these kids. Well, of course, he's misconstruing a lot of facts, because later we learned that the feds, by the way, were very wrong, and later they were found guilty of a lot of problems, a lot of things. And in fact, the Weavers who survived were given a multi-million-dollar award as a result of a court case. But picture what this did to Tara, her imagination. She pictured herself actually as being the one holding this baby with, who had blood on his face from his mother, but the effect that it had on the whole family. So here he was already suffering from paranoia, her father, right? He goes ahead, and this is feeding on his whole philosophy against the government. He goes ahead and he has them even store more food. He buries 1,000 gallons of gas in his field. He stores guns. He gets himself a bullet making machine, because what does he tell the kids? As if everything else isn't scary enough, he says, next time it could be us. So this is really how he tells them about Ruby Ridge and how that impacted on the family. Let's talk a little bit about her father, okay? How did you view him? How would you describe Tara's relationship with him before she went to college? Let's do that. We'll divide it up. First of all, how did you view him? What was her relationship with him before she went to college?
Stephanie has her hand raised.
Yeah, and I certainly don't want to take over, but I mean, it was clear that he was ill, but also that this it's like the power that he had over her, I think was quite remarkable. And how she took a very long time, even into young adulthood, to be able to separate his thoughts and his perceptions as not being what she should be following, and that if she didn't follow those, somehow she was defective.
He was a very charismatic person, wasn't he? He did have a lot of power over her, and not only over her, but later on we see that he has it over a lot of people. Even though, of course, the extreme Mormonism that he practices, it's extreme even to the other Mormons, but he's a very powerful person in terms of his charisma. What else about the way she responded to him?
Marilyn has her hand up.
I just felt that in that relationship, there is a very close connection between an abuser and the one who's abused. And I think that this was very typical of that. It was like the moth to the flame. She didn't know any differently. And I just find there's a real psychology between whoever the abuser is to the abusee, I guess. And that's like, it's a bit sick, but I think it's definitely there.
Very interesting. Yeah, so picture for her growing up in this house with a brother who's so difficult and definitely an abuser, right? Which of course she doesn't recognize at the time at all. And this is one more thing, going back to Virginia Woolf's quote, she doesn't really recognize any of this until she's looking back on it from that perspective of looking back after the time has passed. What's interesting is that she listened to her father blindly, and she even put herself in great danger. Whatever was his worldview, that was her worldview. And that even extended to when she went away to school. Do you remember at Brigham Young, I really laughed about this, how she looked at all the other girls, and she was seeing them through her father's eyes still, even at that point. And she thought they were just like harlots, you know. One of them was wearing a tank top, and one was wearing shorts with the word juicy on the back. You know, she was very taken aback and very offended by all of this. And there were girls that were shopping on the Sabbath. These were all good Mormon girls at Brigham Young University, but compared to the way her father viewed the world, and thus she was seeing the world, of course, she called them Gentiles. And then her relationship changes. So now what causes it to change? Where does she start to change? The way she views him. Well, picture, she goes away to school now, and all of a sudden, what is she learning? She's learning a whole different history, a whole other worldview than her father told her. In fact, it was funny because there's one, going back to this Oprah interview, she had learned about slavery from a book that her father had, a very old, they had no books in the house, but they did have a few old books. One of them was about slavery. So Oprah says, well, what did they teach you about slavery in this book? She says, oh, you don't really want to know. And Oprah says, no, tell me. She goes, okay, the book that I read about slavery was how terrible it was. It was so terrible because it was so difficult on the slave owners. And of course you can imagine Oprah starts laughing. She says, oh, I guess I never saw that book, you know. But it was really funny because she just had this worldview of what her father had, you know, whatever that was. I mean, all of a sudden she goes to school and she learns actually about civil rights. It's the first time she's even heard about it. And she starts to realize that there are other opinions and a different side of history, because she realized to her father there were only two ways of looking at something, actually one way, and that was it was either the truth or it was lies. That was it.
Lynda,
So,
Lynda,
yeah.
Lindsay had a comment as well. Lindsay had a comment.
Oh, you mentioned it already. I was just astounded because I had never heard slavery described the way it was in her dad's books before, and that also sticks out to me as being when she learns in college what it really involved and how that contrasted with what her dad taught her in the book about what a burden it was to feed them all or something like that. And you're just like, I think that's when she went, whoa, you know.
That's exactly when she went, whoa. That's exactly right. That's right. Yeah, that was her response. The same way when she finally goes home. You remember how the mountain keeps calling her back? She keeps going back for more, even as she's changing. She goes back for more and more abuse, I guess you could say. But she goes back, and what does she hear after she's reading all these books and learning all these great thinkers and learning about all these world events? And her father starts to quote about Jews and how Jews started the Holocaust, and we started World War II. We financed World War II. And all of a sudden she said, what does she realize? Her father is quoting directly out of the Protocols of Zion. And all of a sudden she starts to see this whole other perspective. It's totally, totally new to her. Any other comments about the relationship with the father? I want to move on to her relationship with her mother.
Marilyn had a comment. Oh, hold on one sec. Hold on one sec. She's trying to unmute.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that one of the things is a big part of her education was not learning the difference between lies and the truth, but his truth.
That's right.
Because I think the biggest education she had to come up with was what was the difference between his truth and the truth.
Absolutely. And according to him, there was only one truth, and that was his truth. And therein was the difficulty.
I think that had to be a bigger difficulty for her, because when she had to realize that the truth and his truth, there was a big discrepancy there.
Absolutely. It became the gulf between them. Let's talk a little bit about her mother and her relationship with her mother. And that to me was one of the more interesting things. Tara's relationship with her mother in the early years ends up being very different in the later years. Tell me about her relationship with her mother. Let's talk about that in those early years. Do you remember that? Well, how about this? Tara is given dance lessons. Do you remember that?
Yes.
She's given dance lessons. Her mother drives her to dancing lessons. Her mother later gives her voice lessons. And even when she is thinking about maybe, her father is influencing her, he doesn't want her to go to college, and she's thinking about not going to college, her mother says to her, don't stay here. I always thought you were the one who was going to go bursting out of here. Her mother is so worried that she's going to stay and not leave. So her mother is her supporter in those early days. In fact, when she's bringing her, remember the scene with the recital, and all of the children in the dance recital, all of these kids are wearing sparkly little costumes, and her group in cooperation and just caring about Tara, the teacher goes ahead and gives them long sweatshirts to wear over their costumes, their leotards. But even that, when the father comes to the recital, which the mother didn't even want to tell the father about the recital, he finds out, he comes, he is horrified about the lack of modesty, even though the kids were totally covered, because his idea of women was that you were not to wear anything above the ankle. You were not to show anything above the ankle. So these kids were obviously being very immodest. And he's scolding the mother and scolding Tara on the way home from the dance recital. And mother, who absolutely knew everything and had actually worked closely with the dance teacher in order to come up with the long sweatshirts, the mother says to the father, "Oh, I had no idea. I wish I had known before about these costumes. I'm so sorry. I should have known." And Tara is looking at her mother and thinking she just can't believe what her mother is saying. But obviously her mother is trying to appease the father at that time.
But the mother too, don't you think and it comes out later, that she saw something in Tara that she didn't see in those other kids. And I thought the most amazing was later when she was at Brigham Young and she was questioning if she should stay, and the mother said, of all my kids, like, you have to stay. Like, I think So it does seem that she played that interference for
Right. She
a
did.
purpose. She saw something different in her.
And also, I thought it was so like telling during those early stages when the mom was really sticking up for Tara, but you could, in Tara's examples of dialogue between her parents, she never really stated anywhere in the book that her mom was abused, but you could see through how she reacted to the father that there was an abusive relationship. And it really showed with when she was protecting Tara in those younger days.
Such a good point. The mother was an interesting character, and she would turn a blind. She absolutely went along with the dad, and she was frightened of him. I think she was frightened of him, or also she also bought into this patriarchal belief that was going on in the family. She always went along with him. Do you remember the scene where he wants to drive late at night, start this family return back to the house? Yeah. He wants to go late at night. The roads are icy. It's really late. Even the grandmother, who's in the picture at this point, the grandmother says, why would you start a trip at this late hour on icy roads? He insists, and she writes in the book, Tara observes her mother. Her mother's eyes were dark with worry, but she said nothing. And of course, they all pile into the car, and what happens? A huge crash. And mother is, the first time, I say the first time because believe it or not, there was a second time. The father did the same thing. The first time the mother is severely injured, and they say she actually has a brain injury that she never recovered from. And of course, the father pulls this a second time, and everybody again listens to him. They leave late at night on icy roads, and once again, there's a terrible accident. So what father said went, and mother figured out her ways to hide things from him, cajole him, go along with him. And of course, the worst part, yeah.
Lynda, Lindsay, and then Stephanie both have a comment.
Yeah.
I just wondered so much in the book if the woman is the mother, is she just, not just, but is she an abused woman of a sound mind? You know, she doesn't want to be a midwife, but she doesn't. She doesn't want to do all these things, but she doesn't. Or is she crazy too? And I really wasn't sure. Because it seemed like it wasn't until way later when Tara's back visiting, it was the first time she ever heard her mother stand up to her dad, is the way I sort of read it. Yeah. When he said, get in the kitchen, and she said, you earn the money and then I'll get something like that.
It was the only time.
Like she had never even heard her stand up to him before.
Only
so
time.
I didn't know if do you think she's crazy?
Well, according to Tara, her mother did have this brain injury that she really never recovered from. Of course, you know, her parents dispute that, but yeah, that's what they say. But she was also, she seemed, don't forget, she felt she knew her place according to the father, and maybe according to this extreme Mormonism, you know, her place was in the kitchen, and she was very meek. She just went with everything that he said. Any other thoughts on that?
Stephanie had a comment as well.
First of all, you have to remember where she came from. I mean, her own family was a very different family, and she was raised in that family chose, and her family of choice was to go, you know, with Jean. The other thing is that as much as she submitted to the father, I think towards the end after his burn, she submitted totally. But I think that before that, she had flashes, certainly of independence, and enough that she gave enough, I think, to Tara to enable to, with a little bit of learning and the little bit of things, and even the ballet and singing in Annie and doing all those kind of things, that the mother's, you know, push and pull was a struggle, but she did give Tara something.
She did. She absolutely did. And I think that's one of the reasons Tara wants to remain close with her. She wants that relationship, which is makes the ending quite sad when the mother ends up refusing it. But yeah, she remembers that and she wants that. But the mother does change, because all of a sudden, what happens to the mother? She changes. Do you remember how does she all of a sudden change towards the end of the book? Do you remember this? Yeah. Cookie, I think that's her hand up.
Yeah, Cookie. Cookie, you're still on mute. You have to unmute. There you go. Now you can go.
Edison or anything, and she became very well known in the community. So she wasn't without brains. She knew what this flower and that flower together did these things. And so I don't think she was as bad as you think she was. But she was submissive to the husband. But in the end, they became very wealthy.
Very wealthy. Good point. In the end, her business was so successful from doing the herbs and the essence, the essential oils. They say in the book that she actually turned down an offer of $3 million for her business because everybody was using all of her products. And where she changed, I think, at the end, and certainly the brain power was there, but she all of a sudden did start to get that same wavelength of the husband, which is all of a sudden she believed they were doing God's work, right? And she was transformed at the same time that her husband was sort of transformed even more after his accident. Do you remember that he sets himself on fire? And another workplace accident, he suffers greatly. And he's totally disfigured as a result of this accident from burns. And he tells everybody when he recovers, it's because of her miracle salves that she gave. But also he tells everybody that he was hovering between life and death, and the Lord came to him and ministered to him. The angels ministered to him just as they did for the old prophets in the New Testament, he tells. And he becomes this tremendous, he has this tremendous religious fervor, and Mother takes this on. And all of a sudden she starts to believe that she can heal with her fingers. Do you remember that? It's sort of like, we hear of laying of hands, but now she feels she can kind of feel and make diagnoses and then actually cure the people simply by her fingers and her oils. So she begins to feel she becomes as radical in her beliefs as her husband as time goes on.
Yeah, there was a comment from Arlene, and she was making a comparison. She said, Mom was subservient to Dad, unorthodox. So I think relating to that book film that is out right now.
Right. And again, it's about extremism, isn't it? And also a philosophy about a woman's role. Yeah, good point, good. What I want to talk about, Debbie, how are we doing with time?
I think we need to probably start wrapping up because we're almost at an hour. We're almost at an hour.
Okay, I want to just bring out, Tara was fortunate in her life in one regard, and that she had people that did care about her and that did ultimately encourage her and mentor her. I thought that her first friend, Charles, was a very important person to her, right? It was her first little link to the outside. And Charles really feels sorry for her, and he's trying to help her break out of the mold of her family. But he comes too soon in the process, and she can't. Of course, Charles, we know Charles another way is that her brother Sean uses Charles as a way to humiliate her. Do you remember all of that? Those were terrible scenes when Charles comes for dinner and the brother Sean grabs her by the hair and drags her into the bathroom while Charles is right there and tries to put her head in the toilet, because she won't apologize to him. So Charles sees this and he's really trying to help her, but she's not ready yet to be helped. And when she goes to Brigham Young, she reaches her Jewish history teacher, Professor Carey. Do you remember that part? She goes to him, she's in crisis. She thinks to herself, I came here for singing, but I'm really interested in politics and history, but those aren't fields for women. What should I do? And Professor Carey listens to her, and he's the one who advises her. He says, you know what? I like what you're saying. He says, I think you need to stretch yourself. He goes out of his way and he sees to it that she wins the award, the ability, the scholarship to go to Cambridge for the first time. And that's a life-changing event for her. And once she gets there, do you remember Professor Steinberg, who becomes her supervisor? Interestingly enough, he's a very celebrated author of his works on the Holocaust. And Professor Steinberg mentors her. He encourages her. He teaches her how to write. He tells her that a poorly written sentence is actually a poorly conceived idea, which is really how he teaches her to write. But most of all, he tells her, indeed, after she's done all this reading and all this writing for him, he says, you are a true scholar. You are pure gold. And he tells her that her essay was the best he'd read in all of his 30 years at Cambridge. So, do you remember her reaction? What was her reaction to his high praise?
She couldn't believe it.
He's so uncomfortable with it. So uncomfortable with it. Why? How does she see herself? Who's this person he's talking about? That can't be me. I never fit into this place with all these beautiful, brilliant people at Cambridge. Why is he saying this to me? Because she sees herself still as her brother saw her, as that young girl in the junkyard. She has such low self-esteem that she would have preferred that he criticize her. But she's lucky that she has these wonderful mentors. And in fact, in her acknowledgments, she gives a big shout out and a big thank you to Professor Steinberg. Of course, because we're winding up, I'm going to skip over some other conversation that I wish we could have. But what causes the final breach between Tara and her parents? Well, okay. If you recall, it turns out that her brother Sean has abused her so much. She has told her mother so many times. But finally, she confronts her mother and her father. And her father is so angry. Both of them are denying, absolutely denying that this ever could have happened, this terrible abuse. And they deny, and they absolutely want her to accept their version of history, which is that it never happened. And her father goes ahead and he calls Sean, and he tells Sean to come over so that she can confront him face to face. And of course, he comes over. He is so angry. He's really angry. He sits down next to her on the sofa. Do you remember this scene? It was really scary in the book. He sits down next to her. He's very angry. And he starts to whisper in her ear. And at the same time, he very gently places a knife in her hand. And she feels something wet, and she looks down and she sees it's blood. She knows he didn't cut her, so it's not her blood, it's not his blood. She doesn't know what it is. But at the same time, he's whispering to her, he says, if you're smart, you'll use this knife on yourself because it's better than what I'm going to do to you if you don't. At which point her mother overhears and she goes, oh, that's not called for. That was the extent of her response. Of course, later, what she finds out, Tara, is that unfortunately her brother, when he got the phone call from Dad to come home and have this confrontation, he goes out, Sean, and he slashes to death the family dog, Diego, and it was his blood actually on the knife. So no one believes her. Absolutely no one believes her. Of course, interestingly enough, Sean continues to call her even when she goes back to Cambridge. And he says, you know, the only thing I'm trying to decide is whether I should kill you myself or I should hire an assassin. That might be cheaper because I have to figure in the cost of the flight. He keeps calling and saying this same scary thing to her. And finally, she calls her mother. She says to her mother, you got to make him stop. And her mother says, you know, he doesn't mean it. He really doesn't mean it. And honestly, he doesn't even have the money for that anyways. That's her mother's response. And her father says, did you record it? How do I know for sure this is really what happened? They totally deny her life, her experiences. And of course, in the end, they do believe that she's been taken over by the devil. And Sean cuts her out of his life. He convinces the sister Audrey to cut themselves out of Tara's life. And Tara knows that they're going to talk to all the aunts and uncles, and they're all going to believe that she was taken over by the devil. And of course, this turns out to be a great breach. And of course, what's the effect on her at the end? Do you remember? It's actually a mental breakdown, right? She finds herself in the middle of the street in her pajamas and she can't concentrate, and she's back at Cambridge and she's supposed to be working on her PhD thesis and she can't even read, let alone write. And she goes to counseling. And finally, after a very, very dark time, she goes back and she's finally able to start to read and write, and she is able to complete her thesis, which she had begun 2 years before at Harvard. And she writes this thesis, and what's amazing is that she's 27. It was 10 years to the date that she had begun at Brigham Young, and she was now officially Dr. Westover. And of course, she never really does reestablish the ties that she wanted to in her family. It all came with great cost. And the final question that I would have for you is, why do you think in the end that she decided to write this book? What's your thoughts on that? Why did she feel she needed to write the book?
Lindsay, did you have your hand up?
I started to indicate, and then I wasn't going to because I don't want to speak too much. I think it helped her, but I think it just started such a bigger conversation and dialogue about how we don't see these mountain kids and we don't think about them. I just wondered the whole time, like, is it legal? You know, and it's such an unequal footing that children are on today, even in our own country, let alone other kids in the world, that don't have access to the same education as the kids do at our amazing schools in Cooper City. You know, it's remarkable.
And she would say, to your point, that that's exactly how happy she is now, that that is the result of her book having been published. It's opening up a whole other conversation. You're right. She says she wrote the book that she wished she could have given to herself when she was losing her family. She says, when I was, and I'm quoting, she says, when I was going through that experience, I became aware of how important stories are in telling us how to live, how we should feel. I was losing my family, and it seemed to me there were no stories about that, no stories about what to do when loyalty to your family was somehow in conflict with loyalty to yourself. And I wanted to write about forgiveness with reconciliation, but I didn't want to treat reconciliation as the most important thing. She says, in my life, I know the two might never be together, forgiveness and reconciliation. I might never be able to reconcile with my family, but I did need to believe that I could forgive them regardless. So in the end, she is close with her mother's siblings and their children, and with 3 of her brothers. She is finally at peace. She says she spent so many years enumerating her father's flaws. Now she is able to remember some of his tender qualities. And she realizes that all the changes were in her. She is not the child her father raised. She is no longer the 16-year-old girl who had lived on that mountain. She had changed. She says you could call this selfhood many things. You could call it transformation, metamorphosis, falsity, betrayal. Tara Westover chose to call it education. And that's how she ends her book. I hope you enjoyed our discussion today.
Yay, Lynda. It was
Yay,
fantastic.
all of you.
It was fantastic. If you want to give Lynda a reaction, you can do a clapping hand because that was fantastic. Yay, Lynda. She should see all those clapping hands.
Oh, good. Oh, that's great.
You see them? You see
I'm
them?
loving that my screen is brightening up with a lot of yellows.
A lot of yellow clapping hands. Lynda, that was really wonderful. Just as a reminder, we will be sending out an email about the next book review that we're going to be doing with the Friends of the Sterling Road Library, which is on June 16th. It's going to be The Tattooist of Auschwitz. And we also will be sending out about our live author on June 11th. So look for both of those. We hope to see you there. And somebody just said, can we unmute everybody so we can all say thank you loudly to Lynda? I think it's a fabulous idea. But we really, before we do, I just want to say thank you guys for being here.
So they do.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Most of all, I want to thank all of you for great participation. That's what's made it such a fun time. So thank you all.
Thank you, Debbie and Maya.
Good job for the space, nod space.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Extra closets.
Alexander Kwapnik, I see. A great way to spend the afternoon.
So great to see everybody.
Yeah, it's comparable to our Rio Vista house. Comparable to our Rio Vista house.
Wonderful. Okay.
Thank you, guys.
Great job, Linda. Great job, Linda.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye. See you June